Everyone, my name's Sam Provost. I'm a UN fellow from the far south coast of New South Wales, and I'm a ANU PhD student, and I work in the ANU First Nations portfolio and have been working with this IDN team and Melbourne Uni and IATSIS for about 2 years on this ARDC project. I'm going to quickly lead off on a little bit of context and scope for Nick's more technical discussion on the development of a Indigenous data catalogue. So this session, Nick's going to discuss the beginning stages of the development of a semantic Indigenous metadata catalogue that forms part of Stream 2 of the ARDC Indigenous Research Capability Program run out of the Indigenous Data Network. And the goal of the metadata catalogue is to improve understanding of existing Indigenous data across Australia to collate and enhance their findability through the production of an accessible community-facing metadata catalogue. So this project is principally aimed at addressing the scattered and inadequately labelled Indigenous data existing in this country through assisting First Nations communities in finding and accessing data that has been collected about them, while guiding data custodians towards aligning with care principles, better governance of Indigenous data, and hopefully ultimately Indigenous governance of those data. And as Ray mentioned in the last presentation, First Peoples and communities need a lot of these data repatriated, but in order to do this, they first need to know that they exist and where to find them. And in my experience, I've been working in spatial data for a long time, and it's really difficult to find a lot of this data. It's technically freely available, but you've got to know where to look. So the goal is really to bring this together and make it far more easy for communities to not only know that the data exists, but then where they can find it, who is the current custodian, and what governance protocols are in place over the top. And this process is occurring at multiple scales, from this sort of larger scale that Nick and Sandra and Len have been working on, also down into a smaller scale. So at the ANU, in the First Nations portfolio, we're looking at just trying to get some idea of what the Indigenous research agenda has been historically, looking at legacy data and looking at trying to pull that together to articulate a future Indigenous research agenda. And we know it's not just at ANU, it's most universities. The siloed approach to producing data and maintaining it means that often researchers aren't talking to each other. We get overlap of research, doubling up to the point where sometimes communities are feeling overburdened and over-researched because you've got researchers asking the same questions over and over again. So we're trying to deal with that, and that's quite a process because we've got a number of different kind of catalogues currently, and we're trying to pull them together, as well as look at what about all of the data that was collected before we went and digitized that work. What about legacy data? What about archival data? And that's sort of one part of this Stream 2 stuff, but Nick's going to talk more broadly about the overarching scope and technical capacity of the linked data sheets that we're working on.
Thank you, Sam. I'm Nicholas Carr. I'm from Turrbal and Yagara country in Brisbane, and I pay my respects to the elders of this land that I'm presenting on today. So Sam's positioned our work broadly. This is just a little overview of what I'm going to go through. So a little bit of introductions to the team so that you know who we are. We're kind of in the thick of Indigenous dataing and cataloguing right now. That's the work that we're doing every day. And so we would like to hear your opinions and talk to you. We'd like you to come and talk to us at any stage over this, obviously these 2 days, but while this project's in continuing, we want to hear from people all throughout the project. And the two kind of main bits that we're going to focus on, or I'm going to focus on here, it's this practical applications of Indigenous data governance, and then secondly the or a potential theory of National Indigenous Data Catalogue, and then some other objectives. Okay, so the people in the group that work day to day on this project, you've met Sam already. We've got Sandra over there. She's a technical data expert. We've got Len, who's an Indigenous data researcher. Margie, Over in the corner there is a data governance expert. And myself, I'm actually a data architect, so it's a very technical person. I do technical things with data, and in particular, I translate conceptual ideas into bits and pieces of software and databases, etc. We've got IDN central support from Levi and Kristen and others at the University of Melbourne, and there's additional participants who join us in our weekly meetings. Okay. Now, so we've heard about the tasks in general, and they were presented actually earlier today, as well as by Sam just a minute ago. But I just want to give a couple of notes on an overall general sense of where we're going. And there's no words written on the slides here because I've just thought about hearing what I've heard this morning, what would be relevant to you all to hear now. The phrase I'd like to use as to what we're doing in general is we're trying to characterise existing data and metadata out there in terms that Indigenous people can understand to make judgments about that data. Is this data, does it have anything to do with Indigenous people? If it does, what's it about? Who is involved in it? What can we do with it? And we are mostly talking about the vast amounts of data that's out there. There are just huge catalogues of data, huge databases, and we have to have some way of dealing with that. It's great to have good Indigenous data governance and sovereignty principles on the ground for new data acquisitions and so on, but what are we going to do with the legacy? That's our particular job. Because of this and because of the scale, we have to do automatic things. We have to do technical, automated approaches to some of this. We can't just rely on human inspection of data. We can take, and Sam's done this recently, we can look in a university catalogue, and Sandra's done it with the National Library. They've got huge amounts of data, and a reasonable human can look at one of these data sets and understand, does it have anything to do with Indigenous people? What's it about? Who should we contact if we want to use this? We can make these judgments as a human. What do we do when there's 25,000 of those things? We just can't deal with it like we would a one-off thing. So the general approach that we're taking is we're using a semantic data approach, and I've seen this word come up in a previous presentation. What we're really doing is we're trying to create or repurpose metadata that expresses whatever it is we want to know. So this is a pretty normal kind of data cataloging thing, but the particular approach we're taking is to ensure that descriptions of data and data sets and systems that we come up with or use are kind of open descriptions. This means you don't have to have a system to interpret it. You can read it, or you can get a machine to maybe read lots of it and give you statistics on it, but this is open data, not the data itself, but the descriptions of the data. So you want to be able to process through all the data that's held by the National Library, say, and determine whether these data sets are of interest to you or not. Now, whether the data is public or not is a very different question. And in fact, you might want to be the one to decide that. If you're an Indigenous person, you might want to decide that this data should or shouldn't be openly accessible. But the ability to make that decision, that's what we're interested in facilitating. The last thing to mention here is that this is by influence. As Marcia mentioned, we don't have data. We are looking at other people's data, and we have technical methods and approaches and skills, and we're trying to implement ways of working and assist people taking your objectives on and then returning to you technical and other methods for implementing those. Okay. Now, the specific approach that we're taking in this project at the moment is to create assessment methods. And we know the principles that these assessment methods might assess against, so the care, fair, other kinds of principles, but we are called upon to implement technical assessments of those so that we can run them across a heap of data sets and determine whether there's something there that requires further investigation. We may or may not build a catalogue of Indigenous data sets. We'll come to that in just a minute. But we certainly will promote the assessment of data sets in existing catalogues. Okay, so some of the particular things that are going on. As I mentioned, we're looking at doing different types of assessments, and we've heard of some of these, and a question earlier today was, what is the relevance or utility of care and fair, and are these things what we actually need? Well, we're in the process of assessing that now, and so this is the first thing, is do the systems that exist out there, the principles, reflect what is wanted? There's been a lot of work, and we've seen some of it here today, about principles that matter to Indigenous people in Australia already. We're not trying to invent those principles, we're simply just trying to select the ones that we can implement technical methods against. So Indigenous people tell us these are the things we want to know about data sets, or these are the principles we want to see them, to see data handled with. Our job is to try and work out how to make that happen at a large scale. So we're trying to implement a common assessment process for all the different assessments you might do. It would be, just imagine this, it would be lovely to have a big button where you press it, and what it does is it goes through all the data sets held by the Commonwealth Government. Imagine that we could know such a thing. But go through that list, and what we're going to look for is, what's the FAIR scores of that data set? What are the CARE scores? What are the Indigenous Data Governance Principle scores, or other kinds of scores for those things? And then based on that, we might make decisions. Well, let's not worry so much about those data sets. Those are not important. It requires effort and cost for Indigenous people to manage data. That's true for everybody. So we want to be sure that the data that we're looking at and investigating and putting our time into is actually what we're interested in, not something irrelevant. Now, federal government always comes up with initiatives to rate their data. They do it every other day. And when I used to work at Geoscience Australia as a data manager there, we had the so-called data sets of national significance. That was the flavour of 2015. And the federal government told us, National Archives, tell us what your data sets of national significance are. And we said, well, we're a data agency. We've got heaps of that sort of stuff. Which ones are significant by whose assessment? We had no real criteria for that. So we made something up. And Margie and I just picked the top 10 and sent that off. Not a great outcome, really. So there's another one in line with that data, what's its name, and Sharing Act that doesn't include the word, any Indigenous wording. There is a set of data set descriptors that are being published, and we would like to piggyback on that. If that's what the government really wants, at least federal government, to describe data with, we want to ensure that there are extensions to that can be used to make reasonable Indigenous assessments of that data. Now, we do think that amongst the systems that already exist, the FAIR and the CARE and others, there probably is a need for a slightly different, it's not really, we're not designing the principles here, but an assessment framework against Indigenous data governance roles. And I'm going to talk about some specific part of that in just a minute. But we also think that we need to assess the Indigenousness of data first. And Sam, you're going to have to help me with the word. Is it indigenality or indigeneity? This is one of those words. That's what we're trying to assess. Yeah, so there's a prior assessment here as to whether this data is actually about Indigenous people, things, interests, etc. And some of the principles about that have been mentioned earlier. We're not talking about the principles, we're talking about actually implementing a test. Steps so far. So we actually have to understand those principles, and we're well into that process. And people such as Sandra have been working on this for quite some time, so we're quite sure that we understand those principles as one can understand them. Now, we have done some testing of automated CARE assessments. There are lots of systems that already do FAIR assessments out there. We're looking at CARE ones, and I've been in communication with some colleagues in Canada who do these sorts of things, and we're trying to work out how good our CARE assessment approach is. We've started to design a suite of assessment tools so that we can hopefully in the future take another assessment regime and sort of plug that into the general methodology. If a new assessment technique or set of principles is selected for use by Indigenous communities, we want to work with that. And we've been scoping a catalogue metadata model. Okay, so again, I've already mentioned it. This is the latest and greatest from the government. It's the Australian Government Data Asset Metadata Profile, AGDAMP, and we would like to see either extensions to that or work on top of that that allows us to achieve Indigenous governance objectives. So if the government really is serious about characterising data using this set of metadata, then that's the thing that we should build on top of. It's not rocket science. It's pretty much the same as all the other data catalogue models you've seen out there, hopefully a little bit more up to date than some. The next steps in this particular practical application of Indigenous data governance work that we're doing are to compare the methods that we're using for CARE assessments and so on with other communities. And so some communities have done this, some have gone right down to the technical level, some haven't, and we're going to try and talk to people overseas, Australia, New Zealand, elsewhere, and actually work out whether our technical approach is sort of stacks up. we're going to actually rate data sets. We're going to take a data set and try and score it and see what we get. And does this look sensible at all? Does this help people? Do Indigenous people understand and care about the result that we've got? If they don't, then we probably have to do it again. We're going to do a deep and a broad assessment. And what we mean by this is we will take some data sets and really look at them in detail and try and ensure that the assessments do what a reasonable human would do there. But by the same token, we do actually have to run our assessments across lots of data. So Sam currently is working with the ethics approvals systems in ANU, and there's a lot of data there. There's more than an individual person can reasonably assess, certainly not in a short amount of time. Sandra's working with the National Library, and again, there's thousands of data sets there. Which ones of them look like they're about Indigenous concerns, and what kind of basic scores can we get for them? So that's the sort of the broad approach. And then ultimately what we're going to do is work with data holders and catalogue managers to assess whether our approaches are useful. Okay, so this is this slide here. There's two pictures here, and I just wanted to do a miniature, it's not really a technical dive, but my background is in standardized representation of data, metadata, that sort of thing. And on the left, what you see are very standard terms to describe the roles that people play with respect to data. So this is it's from an international standard, and they're pretty obvious. You know, you can be an author of a data or a document. You can be a funder, and I mentioned some of these earlier today. You can be a user, a stakeholder, etc. So we've thought a little bit about what would Indigenous equivalence or non-equivalence to some of these roles be. And what you see on the right there are just some named and described roles. I made these up. Nobody's endorsed them. Nobody agrees with them necessarily. I've just made them up for discussion, but let's just look at one of these. Is there a role to be an Indigenous custodian that is distinct from a normal custodian? Could we have a data set somewhere that it's in the University of Melbourne? The University of Melbourne or someone in the University of Melbourne is the custodian of that, in the sense that if you want to get it, you've got to call them. But is there a different role for an Indigenous custodian which has something else to say? For instance, if you technically want to get the data set, maybe that custodian's the person to give it to you. Maybe, though, whether you should be able to get the data set is really something that the Indigenous custodian might need to answer first. So in this case, we could imagine that a custodian's job, if an Indigenous custodian is present, is to talk to them or defer to them. And in fact, we heard it shouldn't be an advisory thing. This should be the requirement, in fact, that Indigenous custodian is consulted. I thought of some other roles, and not all of them are direct governance ones. What if the data is about Indigenous people? Is there a role to be the subject of a data set? We think that there should be. This will help us assess exactly who could play other roles. If we know that this mob are the mob that the data is about, we might then go to that mob and try and find out who from them or someone that they nominate could be an Indigenous custodian or other. Now, this level of role description is the kind of thing that we have to have in order to be able to do the kinds of assessments we need. We're going to need to see in catalogues either Indigenous people indicated with these particular roles, or these roles allocated to people in order to actually do something at scale. We have to have them. Now, I don't know what all these roles should be. This is a question to you guys and others, and we will be repeating this question over the next little while. What are the roles that make sense to you? That was part of my question to one of the groups earlier, is that you are Indigenous people making decisions about Indigenous data. What are the roles that are associated with that data? We need to know that. We're asking, not telling. Okay, now one of the other things that we're going to do is there are these scoring mechanisms that we've talked about, FAIR and CARE and other scores. They produce widgets. I've just made this one up here, but it's the kind of thing you might see. There's a data set, it's been assessed, it's got an F score of this, an A of that, etc., etc. This is at least for those elements, it's quite a linear thing. You're either 1, 2, 3, or 4. You know, 1 is not so good, 2 is better, etc., etc. That's not necessarily going to work for the kinds of scores that we're after. It may be that CARE assessments give us something like this. This is made up again. What we see here is there might be 2 data sets, and they score against the CARE principles in patches. For this aspect, they're not good, red. For this aspect, good, green. But there's not any sort of sense of linearity there. And so then we have to kind of look at those. Which of those pictures looks better? Well, one of them's got a bit more green than the other. It's probably better. But it might not be a linear thing. So we're trying to work with those conceptual models. Can we come up with a linear model? Should we? This is a hard data science question for these principles which are articulated for humans to read and understand. But to do assessments at scale, we've got to get it down to that next level. Yeah. So again, nothing's set here. This is what we're doing, and we're trying to work out what makes sense for people. And the ultimate test is, if we present pictures like this to people for data sets, does it actually make any sense? Have they learned something new other than them having to read through all the elements of the data set? If they saw 10,000 of these, would they say, well, if it's red in the top left corner, bad, 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 bad. Yeah, if it's red in the bottom right corner, it's not such a big deal. So that's the kind of thing that we hope people will come to. Now, two other very quick points. The National Indigenous Data Catalogue. We have resisted, as it says there, nominating a particular target for a particular catalogue. We, at the beginning of this project, which was 6 months or so ago, we thought we don't want to say that we are or are not going to make a catalogue. There are loads of catalogues out there. There are organisations that may support an Indigenous data network by allowing use of their catalogue. There are national and organisation and community-led systems out there. Are any of those appropriate for a broad national Indigenous data scope? We're still trying to work that out. We want to hear from people who have opinions on this. We know that places such as the Australian Data Archive have facilities. We may be able to use them, the universities, etc. This is tough. If we use an existing system, some people will be happy with that, and a lot of people will be angry. If we make a new system, it'll cost lots of time and money. So this is not an obvious choice, but we are hoping from about now to make a call at least for the next year. We have to actually decide on something soon so that we can progress it. And just to note, of course, the intention here is to get a broad scope, but we need this catalogue to show what is not shown in current catalogues. There's no point us implementing a catalogue that's just yet another data catalogue. This catalogue has to do something like show you how Indigenous data could be scored. We would put some non-Indigenous data in there too, and then hopefully, it gets a low indigeneity or indigeneity score, that sort of thing. But we have to use this catalogue to demonstrate principles, and we either use an existing one or we make one. It has to be sustainable. Whatever we do has to be able to live on. So, last slide here, other objectives. The other two things that we're doing, apart from characterising these principles in technical terms and working on widgets and making a catalogue, is we are trying to implement the best practice, let's say technical best practice publication of spatial data for an Indigenous data set. And we recognise straight off the bat that what makes sense for best practice spatial data may or may not make sense for certain forms of Indigenous data. Here's an obvious example. Len's got some data that talks about police districts that were used for population statistics in the past. Those police districts are imprecise. Can published spatial data deal with imprecision, fuzzy boundaries and that sort of thing? We think that that is a serious concern for spatial data, and so probably we will look at that data set and try and, publish it in some way with imprecision. We see this in the IATSIS language map. The edges of the communities are kind of fuzzy. They're not hard lines, and we want to formalise some of those mechanisms again so that going forward, these things can be run at scale. I actually helped run a couple of large federal government spatial data catalogues anyway, and so this isn't about an Indigenous set of extensions to those that make sense. And the last one is similar, which is characterisation of statistical demographic data for Indigenous purposes. And it was mentioned earlier that the saltwater people, etc., are not characterised. That dimension of a person's character is not included in the data. So in our characterisation that we're working on here, we will work on, we hope to again ask Indigenous people, say there's statistical data there, we've got the dimensions of that, it's about age, etc., etc. What other dimensions could or should be there that should be looked for, that should be characterised? And so we might indicate statistical data dimensions that improve Indigenous people's happiness with the data and also interpretations of that data. So those are the two tail-end tasks. Well, I think that's all my slides, so I think it's over to discussion. Is that right? Questions? Yep.
Thank you, Nick. That was extremely interesting. That's it from your team? No, Len? No? Excellent. Thank you. I've just noticed from your bio that you were at Melbourne School of Engineering, and I think one of the things I really resonated with that conversation in terms of the practical considerations for how things are going to be done is a really important thing to discuss, because it's really the nuts and bolts and how it's going to work. And you need those technical minds and the architects and the data minds to really collaborate and work with the heart and the human side, which is the Indigenous aspect, to make it work properly. So thank you. That was extremely interesting. We now move on to the roundtable discussion post the presentation. I'd like to see how our online participants are going. We've still got quite a lot of activity online and a lot of participants, and it would be great to keep them involved in the conversation. After Nick's presentation, do we have any questions or comments from our online participants?
Dinesh from the National Indigenous Australians Agency. Did you want to ask your question, or did you want me to do it? In the context of IDG, is there a distinction between the role of being a data owner versus a data custodian? If there is a difference, how would this play out legally, given privacy protection laws are usually articulated through the lens of custodianship instead of ownership?
Well, sure, in general. Well, look, if there is a difference, firstly, I'd like to hear from the Indigenous community what they think the difference is. The only thing that I can really do is characterise what I'm told to characterise in a way that can be used by machines. That's really my job. Now, this has come up a couple of times, but there could be differences between what the Indigenous community want roles to be and what non-Indigenous legislation and other things then go and do with that. And I, again, can't really solve those things. But, you know, the least we can do is to create, based on the principles in Indigenous thought, roles that make sense to Indigenous people within the lifetime of this project. We can do that, a first pass, and then we can try and work out exactly how those roles interact with non-Indigenous roles and what the responsibilities and requirements for the people holding those roles are to be. So, you know, is the particular question about are creators and custodians the same thing? I mean, maybe, maybe not. It's actually not, because you're going to have Indigenous custodians of data that they never created, but is about them or is about their stuff. So I would have thought that the most obvious first role is an Indigenous custodian, and it's distinct from a non-Indigenous or other custodian. But what other Indigenous roles make sense? We don't know the answer to that yet.
Thank you, Nick. We've got a question from an in-person participant.
Oh, hi. Thanks for that, Nick. I've just got two things, just one comment. I don't know if anyone with a legal bent has got any views on the thought of legal ownership, and there's a concept of moral ownership. I don't know if that's a thing in Australia, but perhaps overseas it might be a role. But Nick, do you have any feeling for how you represent in metadata in this machine-readable way information that's complex around the care principles, things that might be conversations, memorandums of understanding, appropriate governance and things like that? These are complex ideas. Any thoughts?
I've got two angles of thought on this. One of them, very selfishly, is out of my PhD, funnily enough, and I really didn't expect this to come up. But in my PhD, which was many years ago now, I was looking at not just roles and responsibilities, but actions that could be required, sort of like a checklist. You've got to do these things, and then ways of representing whether those things were actually done. Now, I don't know the specific things that should be done in order for Indigenous data to be used, but the mechanisms, I'll just give you one example. A few years ago, CSIRO and other agencies were involved in coal seam gas data acquisition and use. And to release certain data, you had to go through checklists. You know, was the data anonymised, not from people, but from commercial interests? Was it aggregated? These kinds of things. And technical assessments of the data could actually be done to tick those off. So you had this sort of requirements and then a potential set of requirements resolutions that maybe you could automatically assess that 4 of the 10 things were done and a human didn't need to look at those. The reason for going into this sort of level of detail was that was a system of thousands and thousands of coal seam gas data sets. And it's the kind of system that we would see at a large scale for Indigenous data. Huge collections of data sets at departments, which ones are about Indigenous things. Can we assess that certain, do they even have Indigenous custodians nominated? Et cetera, et cetera. So this requirements and requirements resolutions at a machine level is something that needs to be taken seriously. I can't remember what the other angle I was going to talk about was, but I'll talk to you after, Megan. Megan and I know each other.
Thank you. We have a question coming in from online from Matt Belgard. Matt, are you ready to ask away?
Oh, thank you. It's just to follow up on that, the commentary around checklist. I'm actually going to talk to that tomorrow. And the QT strategy was that the policy for data management, and it's not just digital data, but also primary materials, most academics didn't really read it, or if they read it, they didn't understand it. And so we really wanted to focus on roles and responsibilities, not just the researchers, but the heads of schools, and centre directors, faculty deans, all the way through to facilities management, Office of Research Ethics and Integrity, contracting, legal, etc. And it's now moved into audit and risk. And so we have developed an online checklist, and exactly as Nick has just described, we wanted to keep it simple, and we wanted to use it effectively as an engagement tool. Have you spoken to the relevant stakeholders, and have they approved in order to go to the next stage? And we can bespoke that to laboratory books that are recorded in science, in physics and chemistry, isn't necessarily something that's relevant to creative industries. And so you wanted to bespoke and sort of channel it off. So I just wanted to highlight that we have thought along those lines, and I can just show a couple of screenshots. And if there's time, I can even demonstrate it tomorrow. But I'll stop there. But certainly that is, I think when I spoke to Marcia and Kristen last week, this is the sort of opportunity of how do we utilise digital technologies to enhance the gates and the decision-making that's been discussed this afternoon.